The summer of 1863 was a turning point in the American Civil War. By that year, the conflict had already claimed countless lives, leaving cities, towns, and fields across the nation scarred and bereft. The Confederate Army, under General Robert E. Lee, sought to shift the momentum of the war by bringing it into Union territory. Crossing the Potomac River in late June, Lee's army moved northward with a bold strategic goal: to threaten key northern cities, draw Union forces away from the South, and potentially force the Union to negotiate peace on Confederate terms. Opposing them was the Army of the Potomac, commanded by General George G. Meade, newly appointed and determined to stop Lee's advance. The two forces were seasoned and capable, each having endured 2 years of bloody campaigns. Yet neither expected that their fateful encounter would take place in a quiet crossroads town in south-central Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. The encounter began almost by chance on the morning of July 1, 1863. Confederate scouts moving west from Cashtown and Union cavalry sent east to probe the area collided near the town. Skirmishes erupted, and in a matter of hours, what had been reconnaissance became a full-scale engagement. Troops from both sides poured in, converging on the town as if drawn by some inexorable force. The first day of battle was marked by improvisation and chaos. The Confederates advanced from the north and west, striking Union positions along McPherson's Ridge and Oak Ridge. Union defenders, surprised but resilient, attempted to hold their ground, forming hastily organized lines along key elevations. Civilians, many of them farmers, fled from their homes in terror as smoke and fire filled the streets. Cannons thundered across ridges, rifles cracked, and the earth shook beneath the footfalls of thousands of men. Buildings of everyday life, homes, barns, churches, were quickly converted into makeshift hospitals, command posts, and defensive strongpoints. By mid-afternoon, the Union forces began a retreat through Gettysburg itself. Streets that had once carried the rhythm of peaceful town life now ran with blood. Ordinary homes became scenes of combat. Families returned to find their living rooms and kitchens filled with wounded soldiers, the cries of the dying echoing off wooden walls. Officers shouted commands, men scrambled to fill gaps in the lines, and civilians were caught in a maelstrom they could neither understand nor escape. The geography of Gettysburg played a pivotal role. The Union Army established a defensive line along Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, occupying high ground that would become critical over the next 2 days. Cannon fire tore craters into the fields, uprooting trees and leaving landscapes of devastation. Soldiers fell not only to bullets and shells, but also to exhaustion, heat stroke, and disease. The first day alone resulted in thousands of casualties on both sides, creating a human tragedy whose scale would be hard to comprehend for decades. The second day, July 2nd, escalated the intensity and complexity of the engagement. Lee, seeking to outflank the Union Army, targeted the Union left and right. Fierce fighting erupted at key locations: Little Round Top, a rocky hill on the far left; the wheat field, a patch of land that became a maelstrom of hand-to-hand combat; the peach orchard, where artillery and infantry collided with devastating force; and Devil's Den, a jagged rocky outcrop that witnessed some of the most brutal fighting of the war. At Little Round Top, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and his 20th Maine Regiment held the extreme left of the Union line. With ammunition running low and enemy forces pressing hard, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge down the hill, a desperate maneuver that succeeded in holding the position and preventing the Confederates from rolling up the Union flank. Accounts from soldiers describe this charge as chaotic, terrifying, and heroic. Men ran through clouds of smoke, tripping over rocks and falling comrades, blades clashing and muskets firing until the air was thick with noise and confusion. The bravery of those few regiments had a disproportionate effect on the outcome, demonstrating the critical role of individual courage and leadership in a battle of such scale. The psychological toll of the second day was immense. Soldiers were confronted not only with the physical demands of combat, but with the horror of witnessing the deaths of friends, comrades, and even strangers in unimaginable ways. Many wrote letters home describing the battlefield as a sea of corpses, while others recounted hearing the cries of the wounded, seeing bodies crushed under artillery fire, or witnessing entire units decimated in minutes. Medical personnel labored under impossible conditions, amputating limbs without anesthesia in makeshift field hospitals, tending to infections, and attempting to prevent disease from spreading among the living. Civilians who stayed or returned to the town described the sky blackened with smoke, earth scarred with craters, and the deafening sound of musketry that seemed to render all human comprehension inadequate. The third day, July 3rd, brought the infamous Pickett's Charge. Lee sought to break the Union Center along Cemetery Ridge with a massive frontal assault. More than 12,000 Confederate soldiers advanced in disciplined formations across open fields, fully exposed to Union artillery and musket fire. The carnage was unimaginable. Wave after wave of men fell under the combined fire of infantry and artillery, yet they pressed forward with the grim determination. The charge ultimately failed, resulting in staggering losses and marking the effective end of Lee's campaign in the North. In the aftermath, the battlefield was transformed into a landscape of devastation. Over 50,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. Entire regiments ceased to exist, leaving communities and towns across the nation bereft of men who had once represented hope, ambition, and continuity. Civilian families returned to shattered homes, many unable to identify the bodies of loved ones. Burial was often hasty and inadequate, with soldiers interred in shallow graves or simply left exposed until proper arrangements could be made. The sheer scale of suffering left a profound mark not only on those who survived, but on the town of Gettysburg itself. Eyewitness accounts from soldiers and civilians alike describe the land as retaining memory. Residents reported hearing phantom footsteps, glimpsing figures in the mist, and sensing presences where no one should have been. Letters and diaries from the period indicate a pervasive awareness that the horrors of the battlefield had not entirely ended with the cessation of combat. These early reports laid the foundation for what would become the enduring legends of Gettysburg, stories of apparitions, unexplained sounds, and the lingering presence of those who had died in a battle that refused to be forgotten. The Battle of Gettysburg, therefore, was not merely a tactical or strategic event. It was a human catastrophe, a crucible of courage and suffering, and the beginning of a narrative in which history and memory, life and death, would remain intertwined on this Pennsylvania soil for generations.
The battle had ended, but Gettysburg was far from returning to normal. The sounds of cannon and musketry had faded, yet the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, the stench of decay, and the silent cries of those who had no one to bury them. Thousands of wounded and dying soldiers remained scattered across the hills and fields, many of whom had been abandoned in the chaos of retreat. Locals who had survived the fighting now faced an unimaginable task: the cleanup and burial of the dead, the care of the wounded, and the attempt to restore some semblance of order to their shattered town. Homes and barns, once symbols of peace and stability, were transformed into hospitals. Ordinary families were thrust into roles for which they had no preparation. Women sewed bandages from torn sheets, cooked meager meals over fires, and tended to men they did not know, many of whom would never survive the night. Children, terrified and confused, watched as their fathers and neighbors carried corpses from fields and streets, stacking the dead in rows to await proper burial. The mental strain on these civilians cannot be overstated. The town had become a crucible of grief, suffering, and unrelenting death. Medical treatment was rudimentary at best. Surgeons, often working in private homes or barns, performed amputation after amputation, frequently without anesthesia or proper sanitation. Gangrene and infection claimed lives even after wounds were tended. The physical and emotional toll on both patients and medical staff was immense. Journal entries from the time recount scenes of unimaginable horror. I have seen men weep at the sight of their comrades, while others stared blankly at the walls, their minds unable to comprehend what had just occurred, wrote one physician. The ground outside was littered with debris, spent ammunition, broken artillery, and the remnants of uniforms and equipment torn in the heat of battle. In the days following the battle, burial was hasty. Mass graves were dug on the outskirts of town, along ridges and in fields that had witnessed the fiercest fighting. Soldiers were often buried without identification. Some graves contained dozens of bodies, their identities lost to the chaos of combat. Local families did what they could to mark graves, but wooden crosses and hastily etched names could not survive the elements for long. Rain and wind would wash away markers, leaving the dead nameless, their memories preserved only in the minds of those who had survived. The mental strain on these civilians cannot be overstated. The town had become a crucible of grief, suffering, and unrelenting death. Medical treatment was rudimentary at best. Surgeons, often working in private homes or barns, performed amputation after amputation, frequently without anesthesia or proper sanitation. Gangrene and infection claimed lives even after wounds were tended. The physical and emotional toll on both patients and medical staff was immense. Journal entries from the time recount scenes of unimaginable horror. "I have seen men weep at the sight of their comrades, while others stared blankly at the walls, their minds unable to comprehend what had just occurred," wrote one physician. The ground outside was littered with debris, spent ammunition, broken artillery, and the remnants of uniforms and equipment torn in the heat of battle. In the days following the battle, burial was hasty. Mass graves were dug on the outskirts of town, along ridges and in fields that had witnessed the fiercest fighting. Soldiers were often buried without identification. Some graves contained dozens of bodies, their identities lost to the chaos of combat. Local families did what they could to mark graves, but wooden crosses and hastily etched names could not survive the elements for long. Rain and wind would wash away markers, leaving the dead nameless, their memories preserved only in the minds of those who had survived. The psychological effects on the town were profound. Residents reported being unable to sleep, plagued by the sounds and images of the battlefield long after the fighting had ceased. Many described hearing phantom footsteps, cries of the wounded, and whispers of soldiers calling names in the night. Some saw fleeting figures moving through the mist, dressed in tattered uniforms, carrying muskets, or walking with the stiffness of the dead. These reports were often dismissed by skeptics as grief or exhaustion, yet the sheer number of accounts from multiple independent sources suggested that something extraordinary, or at least persistent, was occurring. Local newspapers chronicled some of these experiences, blending factual reporting with anecdotal accounts. One article described a farmer walking through his field at dawn who suddenly encountered a soldier kneeling at a grave that had not existed the day before. When the man spoke, the soldier's lips moved silently, and when he looked up, his eyes were wide with a sorrow that seemed to transcend life itself. Then he disappeared, leaving the farmer stunned, questioning whether he had truly seen what he thought he had. The town's children, less burdened by rational skepticism, were among the first to report consistent sightings. They spoke of figures walking through orchards, of lanterns moving across abandoned fields, and of voices calling for water or urging retreat. Adults, burdened with the demands of survival and recovery, often dismissed these reports, but many quietly admitted they had experienced similar occurrences. The boundaries between reality and memory, life and death began to blur in Gettysburg. Beyond the human and psychological consequences, the landscape itself bore permanent marks. Trees were stripped of branches, crops destroyed, and fences flattened. Wells were contaminated and livestock had been slaughtered or driven away. The once fertile land now seemed haunted, not only by the memories of those who had died, but by the tangible evidence of destruction. The combination of physical devastation, human suffering, and lingering presence created a town caught between the past and the present, a place where the living were forced to coexist with the echoes of unimaginable death. Within weeks, Gettysburg had become a site of pilgrimage for veterans and journalists alike. Survivors returned to pay respects, to search for lost comrades, or simply to witness the aftermath of what had been described as the largest engagement on American soil. Many veterans carried with them stories of apparitions or sensations that defied explanation. Seeing comrades who had died in the battle walking the ridges, hearing commands shouted through empty fields, and feeling the presence of those who had fallen. For the veterans, these experiences were not mere superstition. They were an extension of the trauma of battle, a continuation of the horrors they had endured, and perhaps a reminder that the land itself could not release what it had witnessed.
As Gettysburg slowly began to recover from the physical devastation of battle, a different kind of story began to emerge. One that merged memory, trauma, and the unexplained. Within weeks of the conflict's end, residents, soldiers, and visitors began reporting occurrences that seemed to defy conventional understanding. These were not merely fleeting illusions. They were detailed sightings, repeated patterns, and experiences that left witnesses convinced that the dead had not entirely left the fields where they had fallen. One of the earliest reported phenomena came from the fields surrounding Little Round Top. Local farmers, returning to assess the damage to their crops, spoke of figures in blue and gray appearing in the mist at dawn or dusk. Often, these figures were in full uniform, standing in formation or walking with the precision of trained soldiers. When approached, they would vanish, leaving only footprints pressed into the dew-laden grass. Some witnesses claimed the figures were engaged in drills, their movements eerily accurate, as though the battle were still ongoing in a parallel, imperceptible dimension. In Devil's Den, the jagged rocks that had been the site of some of the most brutal fighting, stories emerged of phantom snipers and fallen soldiers frozen in the positions they had assumed moments before death. Visitors to the site often reported sudden temperature drops, the distinct smell of gunpowder, and the sensation of being observed. One early account described a young boy watching a soldier emerge from the shadows carrying a musket, only to fade completely into the rock formations when a family member called to him. Local newspapers, while skeptical, occasionally published these reports, giving them a faint legitimacy that drew more visitors curious to witness the phenomena firsthand. Sachs Covered Bridge, to the west of Gettysburg, became another locus of reported activity. Built in 1854, the bridge had been used by both Union and Confederate troops during the battle. Accounts surfaced of figures walking the bridge at night, often appearing disoriented or as if searching for something lost. Witnesses described seeing shadows of men swinging from the rafters, lanterns lit in the darkness, or the echo of footsteps that had no source. In letters sent to newspapers and family members, locals expressed the unease that permeated the area, noting that even days after the battle, the bridge seemed to serve as a conduit between the living and the dead. Soldiers themselves, returning to Gettysburg to witness the aftermath, contributed to the growing collection of ghost stories. Many reported seeing comrades who had died during the fighting, sometimes in the exact locations where they had fallen. One veteran described standing on Cemetery Ridge when he saw the outline of a sergeant from his unit, limping as he had moments before being struck by artillery, waving as though beckoning him forward. When the veteran blinked, the figure had disappeared, leaving only a lingering sense of sorrow. Others describe hearing whispered commands, the rolling of cannons and cries of anguish carried on the wind, even when the battlefield was quiet. These accounts were often dismissed by skeptics as hallucinations or the psychological residue of trauma, but the frequency and consistency of the reports made them difficult to ignore. Civilians contributed their own observations, many of which aligned with those of soldiers. Women tending to fields reported seeing soldiers kneeling by graves, crying silently or praying before disappearing when approached. Children described ghostly cavalrymen riding across open fields, their horses' hooves making no sound, yet leaving discernible tracks in soft soil or snow. Some townspeople claimed that their pets reacted violently to unseen presences, barking at empty air or refusing to enter certain areas. These combined accounts created a pattern of repeated phenomena that cannot be easily dismissed as coincidence or imagination. One particularly detailed account comes from the widow of a Union soldier who returned to Gettysburg with her young son in late summer. As they walked near the wheat field, she recalled seeing a group of soldiers in Union blue advancing across the field as if engaged in an exercise. When she called out to them, the figures stopped, turned to face her, and then vanished entirely. Her son insisted he had seen the men pause to look at him before disappearing. The story was later corroborated by another family visiting the area on the same day, who described seeing the same figures in identical positions. Historians and scholars studying these accounts have noted several consistent themes. The apparitions often appear where the fighting was heaviest, at dawn or dusk, and seem to replicate behaviors from the battle itself, marching, drilling, or tending to the wounded. These observations suggest that the experiences are not random, but tied intimately to the memory of the conflict and the intense human suffering that occurred. Even decades later, veterans who returned for reunions at Gettysburg spoke quietly of encounters with the past. One elderly soldier recounted sitting on Cemetery Hill at sunset, hearing the faint crack of musket fire and the distant drum beats, only to see figures moving across the ridge in the golden light, as though replaying events from 50 years earlier. These reports were often met with polite skepticism by others, yet the soldier insisted that what he witnessed was real, and that it could not be explained merely by nostalgia or imagination. The first ghost sightings, therefore, were a combination of psychological trauma, environmental cues, and possibly unexplained phenomena. The battlefield had been a site of extreme violence, and the density of death and suffering may have created conditions in which the human mind, and perhaps something beyond it, was unable to reconcile the enormity of loss. As stories spread through Gettysburg and beyond, the town became synonymous not only with military history, but with lingering presence, a place where memory, trauma, and the unexplained converged. By the late 19th century, Gettysburg had firmly established itself as a pilgrimage site for both veterans and the curious public. Photographers, journalists, and early paranormal investigators began documenting the phenomena. While many accounts could be attributed to suggestion, fatigue, or grief, some remained unexplained, forming the foundation of a legend that would endure for generations. Little Round Top, Devil's Den, Cemetery Ridge, and Sachs Covered Bridge became focal points, areas where the line between history and the supernatural seemed to blur, and where the ghosts of Gettysburg soldiers were set to march again, invisible to all but those willing to see them.
The jagged boulders of Devil's Den and the rocky summit of Little Round Top are among the most iconic landscapes in Gettysburg, not just for their strategic importance during the battle, but for the persistent legends that have grown around them. These sites were the crucibles of some of the most desperate and intense fighting during the three-day engagement, leaving a legacy of death, courage, and, as countless visitors claim, lingering presence. During the battle, Devil's Den was a natural fortress. Its massive, uneven rocks offered cover for Confederate sharpshooters who aimed to suppress Union positions on the adjacent slopes. Union forces, aware of its tactical significance, struggled to dislodge them. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. Men scrambled over boulders, attempting to gain higher ground while avoiding enemy fire. Accounts from both Union and Confederate soldiers describe hand-to-hand combat, with muskets and bayonets clashing in tight spaces between rocks. The cries of the wounded echoed endlessly in the crevices, often mingling with the terrified screams of men trapped beneath fallen stones or the collapsing weight of artillery. Little Round Top on the Union left flank was equally significant. Its height offered a commanding view of the battlefield, and control of its summit was critical. Colonel Joshua Chamberlain's 20th Maine Regiment held the line against repeated Confederate assaults, engaging in what would become legendary for both courage and tactical ingenuity. Chamberlain's famed bayonet charge down the slope, executed with dwindling ammunition, saved the flank but left the landscape strewn with the dead and dying. Soldiers' personal accounts recount the chaos. Men falling beside friends, screams lost amid the roar of artillery, and the relentless advance of the enemy despite the carnage around them. The aftermath of these engagements transformed the terrain into a grim memorial of suffering. Bodies were left exposed for days, scavenged for scavengers, or buried hastily in shallow graves. The twisted remnants of uniforms, weapons, and artillery littered the ground, and the earth itself seemed to carry the memory of the violence that had occurred. It was within this context that the first stories of hauntings emerged.
At Devil's Den, visitors in the late 19th and early 20th centuries reported seeing ghostly figures moving between the rocks. One account tells of a man walking through the boulders at dawn, witnessing a soldier in gray crouching behind the rock, aiming an invisible rifle. The figure appeared fully corporeal, with uniform details clearly visible before vanishing suddenly when the observer called out. Similar experiences were reported repeatedly, often describing soldiers reenacting moments of combat, patrolling positions, or tending to invisible wounds. Little Round Top likewise became a focus of spectral sightings. Veterans returning for reunions claimed to see comrades who had fallen decades earlier, standing at the positions they once defended. Witnesses described ghostly units marching in formation, drums beating without source, and the sound of musket fire that seemed eerily precise. In some accounts, these apparitions appeared only briefly, visible in the morning mist or at twilight, fading as if unwilling to intrude fully into the world of the living. The consistency of these reports is remarkable. Across decades, from the post-war years into the 20th century, multiple independent observers described similar phenomena: sudden cold spots, unexplained footsteps, fleeting shadows, and the sense of being watched. Photographers visiting Devil's Den occasionally reported anomalies in their photographs: figures appearing where no one stood, or movements caught in long exposures that could not be attributed to known objects. These accounts contributed to the reputation of these locations as epicenters of haunting, cementing their place in Gettysburg lore. The psychological dimension cannot be ignored. Soldiers who survived the battle carried trauma that would shape their perceptions for the rest of their lives. Many reported visions, often of fallen comrades, sometimes immediately after the battle, sometimes decades later. Civilians who lived through the aftermath were affected similarly, their proximity to the dead and dying leaving an imprint that some scholars argue could manifest as vivid apparitions or auditory phenomena. Whether these experiences are purely psychological, residual energy of intense trauma, or something else entirely, the stories persisted with uncanny uniformity. Modern investigations have revisited these areas with technology and research methods that previous generations lacked. Paranormal investigators and historians alike have documented temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic anomalies, and audio phenomena in Devil's Den and Little Round Top. Eyewitness accounts are often corroborated by multiple sources, sometimes decades apart. One contemporary example involves a guided tour where several participants independently reported hearing distant rifle fire and cries of men, while no sound source existed, nor did the tour guides prompt them. The combination of battlefield history, traumatic legacy, and physical landscape creates a unique environment. Devil's Den and Little Round Top were shaped by human conflict, sacrifice, and suffering, and these elements intertwine with the legends of haunting. Visitors today often report an uneasy feeling, a sense that the land is charged with memory and that the past remains palpably present. The significance of these locations extends beyond supernatural speculation. They offer insight into human behavior under extreme conditions, the consequences of large-scale violence, and the enduring relationship between memory, trauma, and place. The stones, hills, and fields are more than topography. They're a canvas on which history, legend, and memory continue to be written. In examining Devil's Den and Little Round Top, we encounter the intersection of fact and legend. The meticulous records of troop movements, casualty lists, and personal diaries provide a detailed understanding of what transpired, while eyewitness accounts of hauntings add a layer of human experience that cannot be quantified. Together, they form a narrative that is simultaneously historical and spectral, tangible and ethereal, a story of Gettysburg that continues to unfold to this day.
Long after the last gunpowder smoke drifted into the heavens and the cries of battle dissolved into the wind, Gettysburg remained restless. The fields where men once fought and fell refused to forget. Beneath the quiet rustle of the grass, beneath the hum of cicadas and the sigh of the breeze, something lingered, an echo too deliberate to be mere chance. It began, locals said, in the evenings, When the sun sank low and cast its golden light across the ridges, a strange hush fell upon the land. Even the birds seemed to pause their song, as though listening. Then, faintly, from nowhere and everywhere at once, came whispers, soft as a prayer, sorrowful as a hymn. Those who stopped to listen swore they could make out words. Not clearly, not in any tongue entirely their own, fragments of pleas, names half-spoken, a murmur like men calling across fog. Some believed it was the wind weaving through the tall grass, others that the voices of the fallen still wandered the earth, bound to the soil that drank their blood. Farmers who returned to reclaim their lands found the air heavy, the ground uneasy. Oxen would balk, refusing to plow certain corners. Horses reared without warning, their nostrils flaring at invisible shapes. One farmer's journal tells of hearing, late one night, a steady, rhythmic pounding, like the tramp of marching boots, echoing faintly from the fields, though no one was in sight. In the years following the war, these stories spread like quiet rumor. A widow from the nearby township claimed that each evening, as she lit her lantern, she saw silhouettes moving against the twilight, hundreds of them, silent and slow, as though walking home from battle. When she called out, they vanished into the mists, leaving only the echo of footsteps and a chill that lingered long after. By the turn of the century, the whispers became part of the land's lore. Travelers spoke of a sorrowful hum rising from the earth after rainfall, when the ground was damp and the air smelled of iron. Some described the sensation of invisible hands brushing against their arms, or a breath at the nape of the neck when standing alone at dusk. It was not fear they felt, but something deeper, grief, ancient and unfathomable, pressing down upon the heart like the weight of centuries. In the archives of the old Gettysburg College lies a letter written by a young student in 1903. He wrote of walking through the fields on a moonlit night and hearing faint singing, a low, mournful melody carried by unseen voices. He followed the sound until it faded into the distance, leaving him standing amidst the gravestones, tears upon his face, though he could not say why. Many believed the fields themselves had become alive with memory. The soil was no longer mere earth, but a vessel for the imprints of all it had witnessed, the cries, the prayers, the final gasps of dying men. Each blade of grass held a fragment of sorrow, each stone was heavy with silence. To walk there was to step into the threshold of two worlds, where time folded in the boundary between the living and the dead, thinned like mist. In the years after, spiritualists flocked to Gettysburg. They came with lanterns and instruments, with notebooks and cameras, eager to prove what the heart already knew. Many returned with tales of light flickering in the distance, of voices captured faintly on wax cylinders, of photographs marked by pale forms and drifting shapes, faces blurred but unmistakably human. Skeptics dismissed it all as imagination, yet the stories did not fade. They multiplied. Soldiers stationed nearby during the First World War wrote of strange patrols seen moving across the fields at night, wearing uniforms of another age. They would salute them, only for the figures to dissolve before their eyes. And so the legend deepened. Locals began to speak of the Whispering Fields, a place where the veil between past and present wore thin, where echoes of history rose like ghosts from the ground. Children were warned to not linger after dark. Visitors were told to tread softly, to speak kindly, for the land remembered all. To this day, those who walk the fields at twilight speak of a stillness unlike any other. The air grows dense, the light dim and golden, and from somewhere far yet near comes the faintest murmur, as though the earth itself were breathing, dreaming, remembering. It is said that Gettysburg is not merely haunted by its dead, it is its dead. The land has absorbed their pain, their courage, their sorrow. The soil is thick with memory, and memory is a thing that does not die. And when the night wind sweeps across the open plain, carrying the scent of grass and rain, it brings with it whispers, words too soft to be heard, yet too powerful to be ignored. They're the voices of a battle that never truly ended, echoing through eternity, reminding all who listen that some stories refuse to be silenced. In the stillness of night, when the stars hang low above the Pennsylvania hills, the battlefield stirs with shapes that belong to another century. They are the ghosts of men who wore gray and blue, soldiers who once faced one another with muskets raised and hearts trembling, now bound together by death in the same unforgiving soil. The first sightings came not long after the war's end. Locals walking home from town told of men appearing on the ridge lines, their uniforms tattered, their faces pale as candlelight. Some marched in silent columns, rifles upon their shoulders. Others wandered alone, eyes vacant, as though searching for something lost. When spoken to, they offered no reply, only vanished into mist or shadow, leaving behind the faint scent of gunpowder and the echo of distant drums. One old farmer swore he saw a solitary figure kneeling beside a crumbling stone wall. The man wore a Union jacket dark with stains, his hand pressed against his chest. The farmer approached slowly, calling out to ask if he needed help, but before he could reach him, the soldier looked up, eyes hollow with sorrow, and dissolved into the air, leaving the grass untouched where he had knelt. Stories like these multiplied. Visitors spoke of ghostly sentries posted along Seminary Ridge, their bayonets glinting in the moonlight, their forms faint as smoke. Others saw cavalry riders crossing the open fields, horses galloping without sound, hooves leaving no prints. In the heart of the old battlefield, a spectral drummer was often heard tapping a slow, mournful rhythm, his cadence echoing through the night until the last note faded into silence. Witnesses described the soldiers as neither menacing nor kind, but lost, caught in an endless march through a battlefield that no longer exists. They move as though bound by duty that death could not dissolve, reliving their final moments in loops of sorrow and confusion. In the cool light of dawn, some have seen them gathered in silent rows, standing as though for roll call. Their faces are blank, their eyes fixed upon a horizon unseen by the living. Then, as the first rays of sunlight touch the fields, they fade, leaving only dew on the grass and a hush too deep to name. During the early 1900s, as Gettysburg became a place of remembrance, caretakers and historians began to share their own accounts. A groundskeeper once entered an old stone barn at dusk and finding it full of soldiers, men tending to the wounded, speaking in hurried tones. The air smelled of blood and smoke. But when he stepped closer, the scene vanished, replaced by emptiness and silence. Even in modern times, the apparitions remain. Tourists walking the fields at night have captured strange lights drifting across the horizon, or photographs showing faint outlines, the curve of a kepi, the gleam of a musket barrel, the blurred form of a man mid-step. Some report hearing voices in the darkness, commands shouted across invisible lines, the clash of bayonets, the anguished cry of a man calling for his brother. They appear not to frighten, but to remind, to bear witness to the cost carved into the land. The ghosts in gray and blue are not enemies now. They are echoes of a single tragedy, soldiers bound together in endless vigil. Spiritualists say they linger because they cannot reconcile their fates. They died believing their cause would be remembered, their sacrifice honored. Yet time erodes memory, and in the silence that follows, their spirits rise to speak where words have been forgotten. Others believe they are not truly ghosts, but memories made manifest, impressions left upon the fabric of the earth by the sheer intensity of that moment in history. Just as light leaves its trace upon glass, so too have these men left theirs upon the fields they fought upon. In the moonlit hours, when fog drifts across the hills like the breath of the dead, you may see them. A soldier leaning upon his rifle, gazing toward the horizon. A rider crossing the plain with eyes hollow as the sky. A drummer boy frozen mid-beat, his hands trembling in eternity. They are the guardians of memory, not yet at rest, not yet gone, standing watch over the battlefield where time itself stands still. And in the hush that follows their passing, you may feel it too, the weight of their sorrow, the ache of their longing, the whisper of a promise unfulfilled. They are the ghosts in gray and blue, marching forever between worlds, calling out to a nation that once tore itself in two. As the guns thundered beyond the ridges and the fields burned with smoke, the town of Gettysburg trembled beneath the weight of war. Its quiet streets, once lined with laughter and the smell of fresh bread, became rivers of anguish. Civilians huddled behind shuttered windows as the roar of cannon shook the glass, and each house became a refuge or a tomb. When the battle ended, the war did not leave. It sank into the brick and timber, seeped into the floorboards, and clung to the rafters like a breath that would not fade. Gettysburg became a town haunted not only by ghosts, but by memory itself. The old houses still stand, their facades calm, their gardens peaceful, yet those who enter speak of strange sounds and colder corners. In one, a woman hears footsteps pacing the upper floor each night at the same hour, though the rooms stand empty. In another, visitors speak of doors opening on their own and voices whispering from stairwells as though the walls themselves are telling their stories. During the days that followed the battle, every building became a hospital. Parlors turned into operating rooms, kitchens into wards. Blood flowed across polished wood and soaked into the grain. The cries of the wounded filled every chamber. Men begging for water, for mercy, for mothers they would never see again. Surgeons worked by candlelight, their hands trembling, their coats dark with stains that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Many say the spirits of those who died there never left. In the old Will's house, where President Lincoln later stayed to write the words that would define a nation's grief, visitors have felt a presence, a heaviness in the air, as though the echoes of that speech still linger, carried by unseen listeners. In homes along Baltimore Street, families speak of spectral soldiers appearing in the mirrors, fleeting glimpses of faces pale and eyes hollow, staring not at the viewer, but beyond them into a world unseen. In one cellar, where dozens once huddled as musket fire rattled the walls, a faint scent of gunpowder still rises after rain, and soft sobs echo in the dark, though no living soul weeps. Children who grow up in Gettysburg speak of dreams filled with marching feet and mournful drums. They wake to find their rooms cold, the night heavy with silence. Some claim they've seen figures standing at the ends of their beds, not malicious, but sorrowful, as if lost on their way home. The taverns, too, are not spared. In one old inn, guests have reported glasses lifting from tables, rocking gently before setting themselves down again. In another, a soldier is said to sit by the hearth on winter nights, his form faint as smoke, staring into the flames as if waiting for a command that would never come. Even the streets carry whispers. On quiet nights, when the fog drifts low and the moon casts its pale light upon the cobblestones, one can hear the soft tread of boots, a cadence too steady to be the wind. Locals say these are the patrols of the forgotten, soldiers who march their rounds through eternity, guarding a town that no longer needs them. The churches, once sanctuaries, hold their own sorrows. In the old Lutheran seminary, the pews still bear faint marks where desperate hands clutched during prayers for deliverance. Parishioners sometimes speak of hymns sung in empty halls, voices blending in solemn harmony, though no choir stands within. Time has softened the scars of Gettysburg, but it has not silenced them. The town breathes with the weight of remembrance. Each doorway is a threshold between worlds, each brick a vessel of memory. Those who live here learn to walk gently, to greet the unseen with respect. For Gettysburg is not merely a place in history, it is a living monument, where the dead still walk beside the living, and the past murmurs softly in the hush between heartbeats. And so the town endures, haunted, hallowed, and eternal, a quiet witness to the price of division, a reminder that some echoes never fade,
and some wounds do not close even with the passing of centuries.
Not all ghosts walk in the night. Some lie quietly in drawers, hang upon walls, or sleep beneath glass in forgotten attics, bound not to flesh or bone, but to the objects that outlive them. At Gettysburg, relics are everywhere. Rusted bullets, shattered bayonets, blood-soaked jackets, and tattered flags. To the collector, they are treasures of history. To the wise, they are something else. Fragments of a tragedy that never released its hold. In the decades after the war, scavengers and pilgrims combed the fields. They unearthed mini balls lodged in trees, buttons gleaming in the soil, and dented canteens half buried in the mud. Some carried them home as souvenirs, proud tokens of a nation's trial. But soon the stories began. Quiet warnings whispered from porch to porch. One farmer who kept a musket found in a ravine claimed that each night it rattled upon the wall, its barrel trembling as if yearning to fire once more. Another man who took home a soldier's belt buckle woke each morning to find it moved, lying in different places, cold to the touch though the room was warm. A family who discovered an officer's sword displayed it proudly above their hearth, but peace fled their home. Sudden tempers flared, dreams turned dark, and footsteps echoed through the halls, though no one walked them. After a year of sleepless nights and shadows at the door, they buried the sword deep in the earth. Only then did the house grow still. In the local museum, curators speak in hushed tones of certain artifacts. A tattered kepi stained brown with age seems to shift when no eyes are upon it. A cracked canteen emits a faint metallic ringing, like a distant cry. Visitors standing before the display cases sometimes feel a hand upon their shoulder, a breath against their ear, a presence both sorrowful and insistent, as if pleading for release. Spiritualists say these relics hold imprints, the lingering essence of men who met violent ends. In the moment of death, they believe the soul clings to what it last touched. A musket fired in desperation, a locket pressed against a beating heart, a torn letter held by trembling fingers, all become vessels of emotion too intense to fade. Even the earth itself is not immune. Soil taken from the fields is said to carry a heaviness, a melancholy that settles upon any home that keeps it. One collector, proud of his growing trove of relics, wrote that after displaying them in his study, he began to hear faint voices murmuring at night. Pages turned on their own, candles sputtered, and a shadow paced the floor until dawn. He sold the entire collection within a year. In the years that followed, rumors spread of cursed relics, objects that brought misfortune to any who disturbed them. A Bible taken from the breast pocket of a fallen chaplain was said to weep tears of water each anniversary of the battle. A torn drum, recovered from the woods, beat softly at midnight, its rhythm like a heartbeat in the dark. Skeptics dismiss such tales as fancy, yet even they grow quiet when walking among the relics. For there is a presence that cannot be denied, a weight in the air, a sense of unseen eyes. The relics of Gettysburg are not mere artifacts. They are silent witnesses, each carrying a fragment of the agony that once shook the earth. And so, many who visit choose not to touch. They stand before the glass with bowed heads, offering a prayer, a whisper of remembrance, as though fearing to wake what sleeps within. For in Gettysburg, even the smallest fragment, a bullet, a button, a torn scrap of cloth, may bear the echo of a dying breath, the last thought of a soldier staring into eternity. These are the cursed relics, remnants of a war that refuses to die, each one a vessel of sorrow, each one a key to the doors between worlds.
In every age, certain souls are drawn to places heavy with remembrance, as though the earth itself whispers their names. Gettysburg is always called to such souls, caretakers, historians, and wanderers who feel the pull of something greater than curiosity. They come not merely to study, but to serve, to guard the threshold between the living and the dead. From the earliest days after the battle, the land seemed to choose its keepers. Old diaries speak of men who arrived intending only to visit, yet found themselves unable to leave. They took work as groundsmen, guides, or gravediggers, compelled by an unseen hand. One wrote that each morning he felt the faint pressure of invisible footsteps beside his own, as if the fallen walked with him through the dew. These guardians often spoke of a strange communion, a silent understanding with the land. They tended the graves as one tends a garden, whispering prayers as they cleared weeds, feeling a peace settle over them as though a burden had been shared. At night, they would linger by the memorial stones, sensing the presence of unseen sentinels standing watch. In the old cemetery, where white markers lined the grass like frozen waves, caretakers have reported hearing voices in the dusk, soft murmurs carried on the wind, fragments of names and blessings. Some claim that, in moments of solitude, they felt a hand upon their shoulder, not heavy but gentle, a gesture of gratitude from those long gone. Historians, too, have spoken of strange coincidences. While researching forgotten soldiers, they have stumbled upon letters or records appearing as if placed deliberately in their path, names matching the whispers they dreamed the night before. Many confess that the work feels guided, as though unseen forces steer them toward truths waiting to be uncovered. Among the locals, a quiet reverence endures. They walk the fields not as tourists, but as pilgrims. They leave flowers upon nameless graves, light candles at dusk, and speak in low tones as if standing in a cathedral, for they know that the dead of Gettysburg are never far, that memory breathes in the soil, and remembrance is a sacred duty. Even the park rangers who patrol the ground speak of moments beyond reason, radios crackling with phantom voices, lanterns flickering when no wind stirs, sudden chills sweeping through summer heat. Yet none feel fear, only awe. They sense that the spirits do not linger in anger, but in longing, waiting for their stories to be told, their names to be remembered. In quiet hours, when mist curls over the monuments and dawn paints the fields in pale gold, these guardians walk alone, heads bowed. They feel the pulse of the land beneath their feet, the heartbeat of history that still thrums through the soil. And they know their purpose, to keep vigil, to bear witness, to ensure that silence never erases what sacrifice has written in blood and stone. For Gettysburg is not merely a battlefield, it is a living testament, a sacred ground where memory itself has taken root. And the guardians, chosen or called, are its stewards, keepers of both story and spirit, tending a flame that must never die. They walk among the whispers between worlds, their footsteps echoing softly beside those of the unseen. And in their quiet devotion, the dead are not forgotten.
There are places in the world where time does not move as it should, where every sunrise feels ancient and every wind carries more than air. Gettysburg is one such place. Beneath its quiet skies, past and present breathe the same breath, and the boundaries between what was and what is blur into something timeless. Those who stand upon its hills at dawn speak of a hush that falls over the land, not silence, but a listening. The earth itself seems to hold its breath, as though waiting for voices long stilled to speak again. And if one listens with the heart, beyond the rustle of leaves and the distant call of crows, they may hear it, the echo that never ends. It is not a sound, but a presence, a vibration in the soul, a pulse in the soil. It hums beneath the grass where soldiers fell, in the walls of homes that became sanctuaries of suffering, in the relics that carry the weight of final moments. It is the echo of courage and fear,
of love and loss, of humanity stripped bare before the storm of fate. Generations have come and gone, yet the echo endures. It whispers through the voices of guides telling their tales, through the reverent steps of pilgrims tracing the paths of the fallen, through the songs sung softly by schoolchildren at memorials. It binds the living to the dead in a chain unbroken by centuries. Some say the echo is the souls themselves, calling out not for release, but remembrance, asking only that their names be spoken, their stories not forgotten. Others believe it is the conscience of a nation, murmuring warnings through the veil of time, that the cost of division is written in blood, and the scars of war are carved not only into earth, but into the heart of all who inherit it. In the stillness of night, when mist drapes the fields like a shroud, and the moonlight turns the monuments pale as bone, the echo deepens. It moves like a tide through the air, brushing against the living with unseen hands, reminding them that history is not dead. It breathes, it mourns, it remembers. And perhaps in some quiet corner of eternity, the soldiers in gray and blue stand side by side now, their battles ceased, their watch eternal, guardians of a lesson carved in sorrow, that even in ruin remembrance can bloom, that even in death there is meaning, and that the earth, once soaked in grief, can become a place of peace. So the echo continues, carried on every wind, woven into every stone. It lives in the stories we tell, in the footsteps we take upon hallowed ground, in the silence we hold when words are not enough. Gettysburg does not sleep. It dreams. Endlessly, mournfully, beautifully. And within its dreaming, the past speaks to all who will listen, for history is not gone. It is here, whispering still. An eternal echo. A voice beyond time. A promise that remembrance is the truest form of peace.
If you enjoyed this video and are still not subscribed, please consider it, as it really helps me out a lot. Thank you.